The morning of October 8, 1943, broke cold and gray over the English countryside. At RAF Thorpe Abbotts in East Anglia, young men barely out of their teens were waking up to another day that might be their last. In the Navigator's quarters of the 100th Bombardment Group, a 24-year-old officer named Harry Crosby was staring at a map spread across his small wooden desk. The target for today was Bremen, one of the most heavily defended cities in all of Germany. What made this morning different, what set Harry apart from every other navigator in the 8th Air Force, was what he was about to do with that map. While other navigators were pulling out their octants and plotting celestial coordinates, Harry was doing something that would have seemed ridiculous to his instructors back at navigation school. He was tracing railway lines with his finger. Railway lines. Not star charts, not complicated trigonometric calculations. Railway lines. This is the story of how one navigator's unconventional approach revolutionized B-17 navigation and saved hundreds of lives in the deadliest air war the world had ever seen. It's the story of practical genius born from desperation, of a young man who threw away the textbook and learned to read the earth itself. And it all started with a simple realization that would change everything. But to understand why Harry's method was so revolutionary, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand what it meant to be a B-17 navigator in 1943, and why the methods they'd been taught in training were, quite frankly, useless. The year was 1942 when Harry Crosby first walked through the gates of Mather Field in California. He'd been a graduate student at the University of Iowa, studying literature and dreaming of becoming a writer. Then came Pearl Harbor, and like thousands of other young Americans, Harry put his dreams on hold and enlisted. He'd washed out of pilot training, but that didn't mean his war was over. The Army Air Forces needed navigators, desperately. Navigation school was supposed to be 18 weeks of intensive training. In peacetime, the same course took 2 years. That should tell you something about how rushed everything was. The instructors crammed their heads full of celestial navigation, teaching them to use octants and sextants to measure the angle between stars and the horizon, to calculate their position using tables and trigonometry. It was beautiful, elegant, scientifically precise, and it was completely worthless over Europe. The problem was simple but devastating. Celestial navigation required one thing above all else: a clear view of the sky. You needed to see the stars, the sun, or the moon. But over Europe, particularly over Germany, the skies were almost never clear. Clouds blanketed the continent for weeks at a time. The weather that made England so famously dreary also made traditional navigation methods obsolete. Harry would later write in his memoir that on most missions he couldn't even see the ground, let alone the stars. The octants and sextants that they'd spent weeks learning to use, they ended up in the trash, literally. There were piles of unused navigation instruments collecting dust at every airfield in England. So what was a navigator supposed to do when everything he'd learned in training was useless? He had to adapt, he had to improvise, and Harry Crosby was about to become very good at both. The 100th Bomb Group earned its nickname the Hard Way. They called it the Bloody 100th because of the staggering casualties they suffered. On one mission to Munster in October 1943, the group sent up 18 aircraft. Only one came back. 15 aircraft lost in a single mission meant 150 experienced airmen were either dead or captured. That was the reality Harry lived with every single day. The pressure on navigators was immense. If you got your crew lost, you were all dead. It was that simple. Running out of fuel over the North Sea meant ditching in freezing water where survival time was measured in minutes. Getting turned around and flying deeper into Germany meant running a gauntlet of flak batteries and fighter attacks with no fuel to spare for evasive maneuvers. And if you brought your formation to the wrong location, you'd just wasted bombs, fuel, and lives on nothing. Harry's first few missions were By his own admission, disasters. On one training flight, engine trouble forced his crew to drop out of formation and return alone. That meant Harry had to navigate them home without the lead aircraft to follow. He managed it, but only because the radio beacon at their field, call sign Splasher 6, was broadcasting loud and clear. He simply zeroed in on the radio signal. But what would he do when radio beacons weren't available? What would he do when jamming made radio navigation impossible? That's when Harry started to develop his weird method, and it began with a simple observation during a practice mission to Liverpool. The route to Liverpool was a straight line across England, carefully plotted to avoid restricted areas. As Harry stared at his map, he noticed something. There was a railway line that ran almost the entire way. If he could see that railway line, he could follow it all the way to the coast, where Liverpool sat waiting at the end of the tracks. It seemed too simple, almost childish. This wasn't the sophisticated navigation they'd taught him at Selman Field. This was just following train tracks, like a child following a trail of breadcrumbs. But it worked. More importantly, it worked when nothing else did. Harry began to study maps with new eyes. He stopped looking for coordinates and calculations. Instead, he looked for features he could actually see from 8,000 feet. Railways were perfect. They were straight. They went places. And they were easy to spot even through light cloud cover. Rivers were good too. They meandered, but they were distinctive and hard to miss. Coastlines were invaluable. And cities, well, cities were impossible to hide, even with all the camouflage in the world. This was pilotage, one of the most ancient forms of navigation. Ships had used it for thousands of years, following coastlines and landmarks. But for some reason, in the modern age of scientific navigation, it had been pushed aside in favor of more complex methods. Harry was bringing it back, and he was about to prove just how effective it could be. The mission to Trondheim, Norway on July 24, 1943, was Harry's big break. It was a 1,900-mile round trip, one of the longest missions the 100th had attempted. Harry was chosen as the navigator for the lead aircraft, flying with Colonel Neil Harding, the group commander. The pressure was enormous. If he messed this up, he'd be navigating not just his own crew into disaster, but the entire formation. The route took them far out over the North Sea, where there were no landmarks to follow, nothing but gray water stretching to every horizon. Harry had to use dead reckoning, calculating their position based on airspeed, heading, and estimated wind drift. It was educated guesswork at best. One error in wind calculation, and they could miss Norway entirely, flying out into the empty ocean until their fuel ran out. But Harry had prepared. He'd studied the approach to Trondheim obsessively. He knew that the Norwegian coast had distinctive fjords cutting deep into the land. He knew that the city itself sat at the end of one of these fjords. If he could just get them to the coast in roughly the right area, he could follow the coastline until he found the right fjord. Then follow that fjord straight to the target. It worked. They hit the target, dropped their bombs, and made it home. Harry was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his navigation on that mission. But more importantly, he'd proven that his method worked. The combination of dead reckoning over water and careful pilotage over land was effective, practical, and could be taught to others. Harry started training other navigators in his techniques. He emphasized studying maps, not for coordinates, but for recognizable features. Learn your railway lines, know your rivers, memorize the distinctive shapes of cities and coastlines. When you're over enemy territory with clouds blocking the sky and jammers blocking the radio, these are the things that will save your life. But Harry's method had one crucial element that made it truly weird, truly unconventional. He didn't just study maps. He studied train schedules. Yes, train schedules. German train schedules. Harry realized something that seems obvious in hindsight, but was revolutionary at the time. Trains were moving. If you could see a train, you could figure out which railway line you were on based on the train schedule and the direction the train was traveling. You could even estimate your position along that line based on when the train had left its last station. This required an intimate knowledge of German railway operations. Harry spent hours poring over intelligence reports about train movements. He knew when the munitions trains ran to the Ruhr Valley. He knew which lines were busy with military traffic and which ones were civilian. He could look down at a moving train and have a pretty good idea of not just where he was, but when he was there. To the other navigators, this seemed insane. They were supposed to be using scientific instruments and mathematical calculations, not reading train schedules like they were planning a vacation. But Harry didn't care how it looked. He cared about results, and his results were undeniable. His crews came home when others didn't. The mission to Regensburg and Africa was the ultimate test of Harry's abilities. This was Operation Frantic, a shuttle mission that would take them across Germany to hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, then continue south to land in North Africa instead of returning to England. The distance pushed the B-17 to its absolute maximum range. There was no margin for error. If Harry's navigation wasn't perfect, they'd run out of fuel over the Mediterranean Sea. Harry spent days preparing. He plotted the route, but he also memorized every feature along the way. He knew which rivers they'd cross and in what order. He knew which cities they'd pass and from which direction. He knew the railway lines that ran through southern Germany. He even knew the shape of the Alps, which would be their landmark, telling them they were close to the Mediterranean. The mission launched on August 17, 1943. It was part of a double strike, with some groups hitting Regensburg while others targeted Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe was waiting for them. The air battle was savage. B-17s fell from the sky trailing smoke and fire. Parachutes blossomed like deadly white flowers. But Harry kept his focus on the navigation, constantly checking landmarks, adjusting their course. They hit the Messerschmitt factory hard, then turned south. Harry guided them over the Alps using the distinctive mountain peaks he'd studied on maps. Then they were over Italy, following the coastline down to their landing field in North Africa. They made it with fuel to spare. Not much spare, but enough. Harry's navigation had been perfect, but the cost of that mission was staggering. The 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers that day. 600 men were killed or captured. The Bloody Hundredth lost several aircraft, but the aircraft Harry navigated made it home, and their crews knew why. They'd trusted his weird method, his railway-following, train schedule reading approach to navigation, and it had saved their lives. October 8, 1943. The date that would define Harry Crosby's war. The target was Bremen, and the Luftwaffe was determined to stop them. Harry was navigating for Major John Kidd in a B-17 named Just A. Snappen. The mission started badly and got worse. The formation was hit by wave after wave of German fighters. The flak over Bremen was the heaviest Harry had ever seen. Just A. Snappen took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire. The explosion tore through the aircraft, knocking out 2 engines and riddling the fuselage with over 1,200 holes. The aircraft went into a spin. Harry was thrown against the side of his compartment, his maps flying everywhere. For a moment, he thought they were going down. But Major Kidd and his co-pilot fought the controls, and somehow, impossibly, they recovered from the spin. But they were in bad shape. 2 engines gone, control surfaces damaged, and 5 crew members wounded, 1 mortally. They were alone, separated from the formation, limping along at low altitude. And they were still deep in German territory, with a long way to go to reach the safety of England. Every German fighter pilot in the area would be looking for stragglers like them. They were easy prey. This was where Harry's weird method became the difference between life and death. With the aircraft damaged, they couldn't maintain altitude. They were flying low, barely 1,000 feet off the ground, but that meant Harry could see the ground clearly, even through the smoke and haze. He pulled out his tattered maps and started navigating by pilotage. Railway here, turn to follow it west. River there, that's the one that leads toward the coast. The navigation was instinctive now, the result of hundreds of hours, studying maps and memorizing features. He called out course corrections to the pilots, keeping them on the most direct route to the English coast. German fighters found them. The gunners on just A-Snappen fought desperately, shooting down 10 German aircraft in a running battle across occupied Europe. But they kept taking hits. Harry's compartment was torn apart, his navigation equipment destroyed. But he didn't need instruments anymore. He knew these landmarks like he knew his own hometown. When they finally reached the English coast, they were too low on fuel and too badly damaged to make it back to their own airfield. Harry found them the closest friendly base, a dummy airfield on the coast designed to look abandoned. He guided them in, and they crash-landed in a field, hitting a tree in the process. The aircraft was a total loss, but the crew was alive. All of them, even the wounded, survived because they'd gotten medical help quickly enough. When Harry climbed out of the wreckage and saw the damage, he couldn't believe they'd made it. The aircraft looked like it had been through a shredder, but they had made it, and it was largely because his navigation had been flawless, even under the worst possible conditions. The story of just A-Snappen made headlines. Newspapers ran photos of the shattered aircraft with over 1,200 shell holes. Harry's weird method of navigation, his reliance on visual landmarks and practical observation rather than complex calculations, had proven itself under the ultimate test. He'd brought a crippled aircraft home through enemy territory, and he'd done it by following train tracks and rivers. After the Bremen mission, Harry was promoted to Group Navigator for the 100th Bomb Group. This meant he was responsible for training all the navigators in the group and planning the navigation for major missions. He could now spread his methods throughout the unit. Harry developed a comprehensive training program. New navigators were required to memorize key features of the routes they'd be flying. They had to know the railways, rivers, and cities by heart. He made them study photos of landmarks taken from various altitudes. He even created simple tests where he'd show them a photo and they'd have to identify which railway line or river it showed. But the most important thing Harry taught was adaptability. When your octant doesn't work because of clouds, don't panic. When your radio compass is being jammed, don't give up. Look out the window, read the ground. The Earth itself is a map, you just have to learn to read it. This wasn't revolutionary because it was complicated. It was revolutionary because it was simple. It was returning to basics, to fundamental navigation that had been used for thousands of years. But in the high-tech world of World War II aviation, where everyone was focused on the latest instruments and techniques, this back-to-basics approach seemed weird, almost primitive. But it worked. And as word spread, other bomb groups started adopting Harry's methods. Lead navigators from other units came to the 100th to learn his techniques. The 8th Air Force began incorporating pilotage training into their navigator courses, emphasizing the visual identification of landmarks. Harry's influence extended beyond just navigation techniques. He revolutionized how missions were planned. Before, mission planners would plot the most direct route to the target, focusing on coordinates and mathematical precision. Harry changed that. He started planning routes that passed over distinctive landmarks that navigators could easily identify. A route might be slightly longer, but if it followed a major river for part of the way, giving navigators an unmistakable reference point, it was worth the extra fuel. If a route could be planned to pass over a distinctive city that was easy to identify from the air, that was better than a shorter route through featureless countryside. This practical approach to navigation saved countless lives. Formations that might have gotten lost and wandered into heavily defended areas stayed on course. Aircraft that got separated from their formations could navigate home independently because their navigators knew how to read the ground. Pilots learned to trust their navigators more because the navigation was based on things they could see and verify themselves. The second shuttle mission to Russia, Operation Frantic II, was perhaps the finest demonstration of Harry's navigation abilities. The route went from England across Germany to hit targets near Berlin, then continued east to land in the Soviet Union. This was an even longer flight than the Africa shuttle, and it passed over some of the most heavily defended territory in Europe. Harry spent weeks planning this mission. He identified every major landmark along the route. He knew that after crossing the English coast, they'd follow a railway through Belgium. Then they'd pick up the Rhine River and follow it east. After bombing the target near Berlin, they'd look for the Oder River and follow it east toward Poland. Then it was a matter of finding the right railway line that would lead them to the landing fields in Soviet-controlled territory. The mission went almost perfectly. Harry's navigation was so precise that the formation arrived at each checkpoint within minutes of the scheduled time. When they landed in Russia, Soviet officers were amazed at the accuracy of the American navigation. They wanted to know what advanced equipment the Americans were using. When Harry explained that he'd navigated primarily by following railways and rivers, they didn't believe him at first. Surely the Americans had some secret radar or radio navigation system? No, Harry explained, just maps, eyes, and experience. As 1943 turned into 1944, the air war over Europe intensified. The 8th Air Force was growing larger, with more groups joining the battle. Mission sizes increased from hundreds of bombers to thousands. On some missions, Harry was responsible for navigating formations of 2,000 aircraft, coordinating the assembly of multiple groups from different airfields, guiding them to the target, and bringing them home. This required an entirely new level of navigation planning. It wasn't enough to navigate one aircraft anymore. Harry had to create plans that would work for dozens of navigators simultaneously, each in their own aircraft, but all working together as part of a coordinated formation. Harry's solution was to create standardized routes with clearly marked checkpoints. Every navigator would have the same landmarks to look for at the same times. If someone got separated from the formation, they could still find their way by following the planned route and looking for the designated checkpoints. These checkpoints were always distinctive features that could be easily identified. A bend in a river, a junction of railway lines, a city with a recognizable shape. Harry would brief all the navigators together before a mission, showing them photos of each checkpoint and explaining exactly what to look for and when. This system transformed how large formations were navigated. Instead of everyone following the lead aircraft blindly, every navigator was independently confirming the route. If the lead navigator made an error, it could be caught and corrected by the other navigators in the formation. This redundancy saved missions that would otherwise have failed. The preparation for D-Day in June 1944 was the busiest period of Harry's war. In the weeks before the invasion, the 100th Bomb Group was flying almost daily missions, hitting targets all along the French coast. Harry worked around the clock, preparing navigation plans for over 100 different missions. He later wrote that he worked for 75 hours straight in the days before D-Day, preparing maps and flight plans. He became so exhausted that his commanding officer ordered him to his quarters to sleep. He slept for 24 hours and woke up to learn that D-Day had happened while he slept. In a way, this was fitting. Harry had done his part in the preparation. The invasion succeeded partly because American bombers had hit their targets so accurately in the preceding weeks, and that accuracy was due in no small part to Harry's navigation planning. By late 1944, Harry had flown 32 combat missions. He'd survived when most of the original 100th Bomb Group had not. Of the 35 crews that had flown to England with the group in May 1943, only one crew completed a full tour of missions. The rest were killed, captured, or scattered among replacement crews. Harry was the only original navigator still with the group. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Harry finally went home, but he'd changed. The young graduate student who'd studied literature at the University of Iowa was gone. In his place was a veteran who'd seen the worst of war and had survived through a combination of skill, luck, and his weird navigation method. After the war, Harry returned to school and eventually became a professor at Boston University, teaching rhetoric and writing. He wrote textbooks on college composition, but he also wrote about his war experiences, eventually publishing his memoir, A Wing and a Prayer, which told the full story of the Bloody Hundredth. The book became a classic of World War II literature. It was unusual because it was written from a navigator's perspective rather than a pilot's. Most war memoirs focused on the glamorous pilots or the brave gunners. Harry's book showed the vital importance of the navigator, the man who got everyone home even when everything else failed. Harry's weird method of navigation had a lasting impact beyond just World War II. The lessons he learned about practical navigation, about adapting when sophisticated systems fail, about using simple visual references. When complex instruments are useless, these lessons remained relevant. When modern aircraft began using GPS and advanced navigation computers, there was a temptation to forget the basics. But military aviation instructors remembered Harry's lessons. They remembered what happened when sophisticated systems failed. They made sure that even in the age of GPS, pilots and navigators still learned to read a map, to identify landmarks, to navigate using nothing but their eyes and their brains. This proved crucial in conflicts like the Gulf War and later operations, where GPS could be unreliable or deliberately jammed by the enemy. Pilots who had learned to navigate the old-fashioned way, using visual landmarks and pilotage, could continue their missions even when their computers failed. Harry's weird method lived on, passed down through generations of military aviators. Harry Crosby died in 2010 at the age of 91. He'd lived a full life after the war, teaching, writing, and sharing his experiences with new generations. At his memorial service, former Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis said of Harry that he was smart, had strong values, and was the nicest guy in the world, but could be tough when needed. That toughness, that determination to find a better way, had saved hundreds of lives during the war. The weird method Harry developed wasn't really weird at all. It was practical genius. It was the willingness to throw away the textbook when the textbook didn't work and to find solutions that did work, even if those solutions seemed too simple, too basic, too primitive. In an age of high technology, Harry's greatest insight was that sometimes the best solution is the simplest one. When your instruments fail, when your radio is jammed, when the clouds block the stars, look out the window. The earth itself will guide you home. You just have to learn to read it. Today, Harry Crosby is remembered as one of the finest navigators of World War II. His story has been featured in documentaries, history books, and most recently the Apple TV series Masters of the Air, where actor Anthony Boyle portrayed him. But more than just being remembered, Harry's methods are still taught, still used, still saving lives. Because the fundamental truth that Harry discovered remains valid no matter how advanced our technology becomes. Machines can fail. Computers can crash. Radio signals can be jammed. But the earth is always there. The rivers still flow. The railways still run. The coastlines still guide you home. All you need is the knowledge to read them and the courage to trust what you see. That was Harry Crosby's weird method, and it got B-17 crews home safe when nothing else could. In the end, the story of Harry Crosby and his unconventional approach to navigation is about more than just World War II. It's about problem solving, about adapting to circumstances, about having the courage to do things differently when the accepted way isn't working. It's about the difference between knowing theory and understanding practice. The navigators who survived the air war over Europe were the ones who learned this lesson. They were the ones who could adapt, who could throw away the octant and pick up the map, who could follow a railway line across Germany because that railway would lead them home. They were the ones who learned to read the earth itself. Harry Crosby's legacy isn't just in the lives he saved or the missions he successfully navigated. It's in the fundamental shift in how military aviation approached navigation. From his experience came new training methods, new planning procedures, new respect for the ancient art of pilotage. The weird method became the standard method, not because it was sophisticated, but because it worked. And in the end, that's all that mattered. In the deadly skies over Europe, with flak bursting around you and fighters diving from above, with your fuel running low and your crew depending on you, what mattered was getting home. Harry Crosby's weird method got them home, and for that, hundreds of airmen owed him their lives. The next time you're in an aircraft and you look down at the ground, think about those B-17 Navigators. Think about Harry Crosby studying his maps by lamplight, tracing railway lines with his finger, memorizing the bends in rivers and the shapes of cities. Think about him in the nose of just a snappin', bringing a shattered aircraft home through enemy territory by following the earth itself. Think about how sometimes the best solutions are the simplest ones, how sometimes the weird method is the one that works, how sometimes when everything else fails, you just have to look out the window and read the ground beneath you, because the earth remembers every journey, every path, every way home. You just have to learn its language. That was Harry Crosby's gift to the world, not just his navigation skills, but his willingness to question, to adapt, to find better ways. In the most dangerous skies in human history, surrounded by death and destruction, he found a path through. He found it not in sophisticated instruments or complex calculations, but in something far simpler and far more profound. He found it in the earth itself, and in doing so, he showed us all that sometimes the weirdest method is simply the wisest one. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is go back to basics. Sometimes survival depends not on the latest technology, but on the oldest wisdom. Sometimes all you need to find your way home is to look down at the ground and read the story written there in rivers and railways and the long shadows of ancient cities. This is the story of how one navigator's weird method got B-17 crews home safe. This is the story of Harry Crosby and the art of reading the earth. This is the story of practical genius in the face of impossible odds. This is the story of the bloody 100th and the navigator who brought them home.